Well, good morning. Sorry I haven't got an opportunity to get weeks 3 and 4 reviews put out to you. We had a fairly significant mutual aid fire. We were on Easter Sunday, and then I was out of town for a conference. So I am sitting here in my backyard, a little bit of a thunderstorm on this Saturday morning, but I'm going to go over weeks 3 and 4, and then I'll pick up on week 5 here, first part of this next week. Again, just want to comment on all the very, very great discussion. I really like to see the interaction that's been going on, because I don't get that in every class. So you guys are all doing a really good job with that, and I do appreciate it. Week 3, we talked about EMS and the types of responses with EMS and the hazards or the risks that we see with EMS. And so we'll just kind of go through that first discussion question. And Jeremy, you kind of talked about the fact that we do multiple calls and we experience multiple risk factors. Certainly violence and BSI issues, all those things definitely we need to pay attention to. And as you said, situational awareness, that really is what it comes down to. Whether it's an EMS call, it's a hazmat call, it's a fire call, it's a technical rescue call, whatever it is, when we're actually doing our operational things, situational awareness is what we need to remember. And the multiple calls to the same individual, you mentioned complacency. That is also a big thing. We get our frequent flyers that we all have. Every department has them. And what tends to occur at times is sometimes we forget to pay attention to what's going on with that individual, and we become complacent, and that's when we get back injuries or other problems happening. So very good points there that you put out. Drew, you kind of talked about line of duty deaths and injuries. You had a lot of different important things there, and when we talk about EMS, in particular with the ambulance services, those that are strictly EMS services, that's the line of duty deaths and injuries aren't tracked, I don't believe, quite as well as they are certainly in the fire service. Now, if it's a fire-based EMS, that gets included, but when it's just a EMS service, we don't always get that information maybe spread out there. But as you talked about, there's a lot of issues. We see line of duty deaths and injuries increasing in the EMS world, and it's because of a lot of factors. You talked about increasing our lights and sirens. The role there is to actually decrease them, because that's going to reduce risk, and we see that fire, law enforcement, doesn't matter. If we can reduce our speeds, it's going to be a whole lot better for us. Getting people trained in CVO and EVOC, I think that's critical. Having some level of driver training is going to be vitally important, and so that's a good thing there. You talked about sterile cockpit and crash test of ambulances. We see ambulances, those big sails driving down the highway in windy conditions, or they lose control a little bit. They're top heavy, and they do become a problem. So all those things are certainly issues in the EMS world. Darren, you talked about slip, trips, and falls. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues. Slip, trips, and falls, and our back injuries are going to be, our lifting problems are going to be probably our biggest issues in the EMS world, and certainly we do see those. Andy, you also mentioned the emergent response, and when do we upgrade, when do we downgrade, and certainly the more that we can downgrade, and I think I mentioned maybe in one of our previous posts, but there's studies out there that show that a 10-mile trip, I believe, going 10 miles an hour faster, it still doesn't get you there only a few seconds earlier. So only on those very rare cases is that going to be life-changing amount of time, and but those are decisions we have to make on the fly and decide, is it a life-threatening emergency that we need to go code, or can we just go normal speeds and get there safely. Stuart, you talked about an interesting one, uncertainty with some of our calls, and you talked about meth addicts and heroin addicts and how they react, and obviously we've got Narcan available to us today and things like that, but we also have to be careful of that. You give Narcan to a guy that's kind of down and out, and all of a sudden he comes up swinging. So we just have to, again, pay attention, good situational awareness, and educating our individuals. Like you said, that's really how we best protect them. Keegan, you talked about lifting, balanced number of crews, having the right number of people. Lifting, that as I said here a few minutes ago, that's probably one of our biggest issues. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in weird positions where we have to be the ones to bear the weight to try to move a patient that's between a tub and a toilet, or between their bed and the wall. We can't get them out of there easily, and unfortunately that's where we start to see the back injuries and back strains and those kinds of things. The other thing, though, you said was balancing of crews. Those crews that are two-person crews, when you need extra bodies, becomes a problem. And for my department here, we are first responders, so we respond to the scene, we provide assistance, and we will send a guy to the hospital with the ambulance if need be, so that they have an extra hand, because our ambulance service does run here with two paramedics or EMTs on board. So whatever we can do to balance the right number of people on that crew to reduce risk, that's what's important. Let's see, Brendan, you talked again about situational awareness, and the one here you talked about was knowing your streets. That's a great comment. If you don't know your streets, you don't know where you're going within your district, how can you truly get there safely and efficiently and so forth? And certainly that is a huge issue that everybody needs to be familiar with where they're going to get there expediently, and if we are reducing our lights and sirens, that even makes it more important that you know your streets better. And you talked about violence and lifting, again, all the same kinds of comments that we've seen, and a lot of you mentioned, and we just need to keep that in mind. Jacqueline, you talked about fatigue, and fatigue is certainly a problem with a lot of departments, especially those in bigger communities where their call volumes are significant, not just in the daytime but at night as well. And for those that are running longer shift schedules, the 4896s, if you're in a busy house or busy station, that's a killer, and fatigue does set in. And when you're on your 36th hour or 48 hours, how sharp are you then compared to when you came into work? So certainly that is a safety issue that we see, and we see it in fire and EMS both together. Kyle, you talked about lights and sirens, again, defensive driving. That really is one of the bigger things. Is even though we might reduce our speeds, we still have to be very good defensive drivers, because what is out there today? People on the cell phone, people texting, people doing those kinds of things, and not paying attention to where they are. And how many times have you not had somebody not pull over for you when you're coming up to them, or they pass you up and not even paying attention? So things like that. Again, good comments there. Matthew, you talked about distracted drivers, just like I mentioned here with Kyle. Distracted drivers, certainly a huge one, and we just need to make the right decisions of when it's an emergent situation or not. Jacob, you're talking about vehicle accidents, cars. They're making them more airtight and soundproof, and they don't necessarily hear the sirens, and they have the radios up, and again, they're listening to Pandora, or they got their phones and they're texting, and all those kinds of distractions. And we have distractions too, as you mentioned. We've got our MDCs in our car, or in our cabs of our ambulances or our engines. Those things are also risk factors. So very good points there. And Brandon Acker, you said, it kind of gets back to, I think, Brendan's comments about knowing your community, but not knowing your areas. within your surroundings, or knowing where is there a greater risk due to the type of or part of the community we're in. Obviously we all have areas that are probably a little bit more shady than others, and we just need to know what the risk factors are around them. And again, situational awareness, as you mentioned, is going to be the key there. Garrett, you talked about again, fatigue and burnout. Certainly we see many people in the EMS field don't last very long. So that's certainly you're right on the mark there. As EMS runs, they continue to go up. People are calling 911 for anything and everything, from a hangnail to I got bit by a mosquito. It's ridiculous, unfortunately, but we still have to go. They call 911, we have to go. So we just have to be cognizant of that. We need to know how to best manage them, and understand the risk factors with that. Also, the risk factors, as you indicated, in the patient area of the ambulance. Eric, you talked about drug overdoses and needle sticks and the violence, and I kind of mentioned that here a little bit ago with Narcan, great drug to help change the outcome, but there also is issues with that. So we have to just be knowledgeable of that. And then Brandon, you indicated some of the unique situations that we're starting to see. We've got cases where individuals were shot when they were trying to come into a home. More and more people are having handguns and rifles and shotguns, and we just, again, need to kind of know where we're at and understand that if there's any kind of potential violent risk, we want to make sure that the law enforcement is there with us as well. So question one, good comments there for week 3 on question 1. The next question, and I'm trying to get my computer up here. The next question is we talked about risks and aspects to our job, station issues, question or issues, safety issues regarding around the station. And even though we may not be in an emergency, there is risk factors at the station itself. And so again, a lot of good comments here regarding that. Brendan, you talked about practicing what you play, and make sure that you have your training instilled, and ready to implement when you're ready to put up new techniques or new tools. Certainly, you want that muscle memory, and again, practicing what you play, as you indicated, that's going to be the key there to help us. Keegan, you talked about learning to understand different situations. Again, this is situational awareness, and we get that through our training. That's really where we do get the situational awareness, and that certainly is how we get that muscle memory, is to just continually practice and read and train up on it. Jacqueline, you talked about national standards. I think one of my next questions has to do with national standards, with training, and that is part of that question, I guess, with national standards is making things safer. Does it make it safer? Certainly a national standard will give everybody, or put everybody on the same playing field, and that is what we're really trying to do there, is to make sure that we all kind of have the same level of knowledge when we come together, because unfortunately we've seen that where one department shows up to help a neighbor, and you've got individuals that have little or no training, and then we're putting them in rough or risky situations. Andy, you talked about a good one. A good point had to do with the 2% dues and how that affects Wisconsin fire departments, and the fact that training appropriately and ensuring that you've trained appropriately to meet those requirements of Department of Safety and Professional Services and 2% dues. And that's something that I think, at least in Wisconsin, is lost a lot of times, is the importance of making sure we maintain what we're supposed to be doing, inspections and and the training and so forth that is required in order to get those 2% dues, because that is a good chunk of money for many departments that helps maintain their operations. Brandon, you talked about the national standard being a mutual aid tool, and that's really what it comes down to. Is we want to make sure that everybody's on the same level of knowledge when they come together. We have essentially kind of a national standard in NFPA standards, but not every department, not every state follows them to the letter. What you find is some states are like Wisconsin, for example, that requires 60 hours. It meets components of the standard 1001, NFPA 1001, but they may not meet all the requirements. But then you have other states like Florida. Here a couple years ago, I went and I got all my certifications done in Florida. I was fortunate; all I had to do was challenge the physical exam, but there it's several hundred hours of training before you can even become a firefighter. Doesn't matter whether you're a volunteer or career in Florida. Here in Texas, they've got two different systems. Here you've got the career side, which you've got to be a firefighter 2, which again is several hundred hours. Or on the volunteer side, they have a state fire marshals and firefighters association that has some training requirements, but again, it's not mandatory for volunteers. So every state is different. In a national standard, the whole idea with that would be try to put everybody in the same playing field there. Jeremy, you talked about muscle memory and trained so that we don't get the job wrong and we don't get the situation wrong, and definitely that is key. Muscle memory, what you want it to do is be able to not have a problem and be able to continue doing your job and not even think about it, because it's already instilled in you what needs to be done as far as suiting up and putting on your PPE and the tasks that you're doing, etc. Drew, you talked about best practice, and using standards, as best practice. Unfortunately, like I said, and I think you mentioned it, every state's different, and so a national standard might be able to better align everybody, and that's what we really would like to see. And Darryl, you actually mentioned in one of your posts replies to Drew is maybe this could help build or set up a national credentialing system, and there's been a lot of discussion of that, but we aren't there yet, and we're coming up on 16 years past 9/11, and when a lot of this stuff got kicked into motion, and we're still working through some of that. So again, the bottom line is so that we know that the guy that's coming to help us, or we're going to help them, we all can feel comfortable with the level of training that we're all working on. Jacob, you talked about just with training, being able to know what to follow, what rules to follow, knowing what standard you need to follow, and you mentioned differences between volunteers and career. Yes, in many communities there are differences with what we respond to. I guess my view has always been, and I wrote my last EFO paper regarding training in particular, and training, improving or increasing the training requirements in Wisconsin in particular, was what I wrote my EFO paper on. But the whole point of my discussion with that is fire doesn't differentiate between a volunteer and a career. We all are faced with the same risks, and therefore, my view, and that's just my view, is that we should all be trained at the same level. And I know that this causes hardships with some volunteer departments, where they feel they don't have the time to get out there and get the training in. But quite honestly, like I said, if we're out there doing that job, it doesn't matter whether we're volunteer or career, the risks are the same. They don't change. And in fact, sometimes I think volunteers are at greater risk because they aren't practicing on a more regular basis than the career guys. So that's my view. Certainly, those that agree maybe disagree, but that's where I feel the standard, or if we come up with a national standard, it ought to be the same for everybody across the board, from every state, from every community. And but that's a hurdle we're still working through. Stuart, you talked about having officers that are training their staff to be able to recognize and be willing to stop and ask to stop unsafe acts. And that's what we want. Is we want our firefighters, our EMTs, we want our members to be able to truly speak up if they think that this is a bad situation. OSHA does allow for that, and allows for us to have a safe workplace, and certainly if we see a safety issue, I would expect us to be able to step up and say something about it. Kyle, you said no to a national standard, but yes to a state standard. And again, I kind of echo my comments before. I guess I don't have maybe as much problems so long as everybody within a state is the same. Crossing from one state to the next is difficult, but certainly, like I said, we all need to be on the same page, and however we come about that is really where we need to go. Matthew, you talked about helpful for departments that are more proactive, and that's what we want everybody to be, is proactive. When we're reactive, obviously something has happened, good, bad, ugly, whatever it might be, and then we've got to deal with that, and that's not really good for our members. It's not good for our communities. So if we can be proactive, that certainly gives us a heads up. It gives us the ability to address issues before they happen. Darren, you talked about regular training again with your mutual aid partners, and that's key. That is key. Here in Port Neches, two neighboring cities that we work together all the time with an automatic aid situation, and the idea there is, we go to help each other out whenever there's a structure fire or any other major emergency that they need the help. One of the things that they used to do, and I'm going to hopefully here this next year, we're going to try to get this back into place, is we shift. I'll take two of their firefighters and they'll come to my station, and two of mine will go to one of the other stations, and we rotate so that they get some time in each station. They get to learn our equipment, our apparatus, and some of our personnel a little bit more personally. And again, that's key, being able to know your mutual aid partners and be comfortable with what they can provide. Eric, you talked about 1403. Again, that is an NFPA standard. Again, it's not mandatory. Again, a lot of states, though, have recognized it and have adopted it. But for live fire training, certainly we have that standard. And it's the same kind of thing. I mean, it helps us to train like we play, as you said, so that we can be safer on the fire ground. And again, national standards, in one way or another, can certainly, I think, help dial that in. Garrett, you talked about standards, keeping us up to date. If we maintain and try to adopt the new ones as they come out every 3 years, and make sure that what we do is in line with them, that's important. But like you said, it may not always work equally for everybody. So you need to know what parts of the standard or what parts of that curriculum or whatever the situation might be, how do they best fit you or work with your department, your community, and adapt it to adjust for it. That's certainly important. And Brandon S., you kind of said the same thing, is that what might work in one community may not work in the other community as far as some of the training requirements. So national standard, gives us those guidelines, and that's what we need to follow. I mean, that's kind of the hope behind it. But then you still need to be able to take a look at that and adapt, and how do I apply this aspect to my own community. So again, a lot of good discussion there on that topic, you guys. I've been very pleased with the amount of discussion that we've had. The last question for week 3 was other aspects that produce significant risk. we know that fire scenes do, but what else is out there? So, that we need to be aware of or pay attention to, and how do we mitigate or manage some of these things? So, Garrett, you talked about normalization of deviances, and again, we talked about that, I think, in one of the other previous weeks. I think it was actually week 2. I talked about NASA and some of the things that they have dealt with because of the Challenger disaster and the Columbia. Normalization of deviance. You're normalizing things that are wrong because you're not taking care of it, or you're just kind of not looking at it and letting it go. And we see that in our business too. And we need to recognize when we're starting to do things like that, and try to resolve those issues. Stuart, you talk about an important risk factor, and I'm experiencing it here in my department, is loss of experience. I have 12-member department, 14 with my assistant chief and I, but 12 members on the floor. And I've got 2 captains that will probably retire in the next year. One has 43 years, one has 33 years with the city, but he was a police officer first, but he came over to the right side. He's over with the good guys now. He's been in the fire department for 27 years. And then my assistant chief has got 26 years. I go from those guys that have a significant amount of experience to a guy with 13 years, and then I go down to 8 years, 7 years, and then 4 years, and then 2 or less. So I'm dealing with a department that is going to be changing here soon, with putting people in supervisory roles that really don't have much of that experience. So that is a huge factor, a huge risk factor, and I think we're seeing that in a lot of communities, and a lot of departments around the country. Brendan, you talked about using your hood and muscle memory, and how you weren't using it initially, but then you had a captain that said, "Hey, you got to put this on. You got to put this on," and it just became muscle memory, and how that fire enveloped you as you were in that attic space, and it saved you and it protected you, and you could continue working. That's a significant reason why we continue to do training, and a great example. I'm glad you came out of that without anything major happening to you. Keegan, you talked about ICS and understanding some of the pitfalls and some of the problems with new technology. New technology is great, but we have to recognize that there is good and bad to that. So again, good comments there on that. And ICS is changing. It's been around a long time, but they're tweaking it a little bit too. So we need to pay attention to where that's going. Darren, you talked about risk reduction and therefore improving safety. That's one of the big things, is if we can go out there and identify risk and reduce it before it happens, ultimately then we will improve our safety within our departments. Jacob, you talked about air improvements, for example, air management. We've got great tools, we've got great SCBAs, we've got all this good stuff, and we need to understand, though, how it does help us. And air management, how do you get your hands around air management? Well, doing some training and putting your people in various levels of work to see how their bodies respond. A standard 30-minute bottle, if I'm working hard, I'm going to get 15 minutes. But if I'm just walking around, I might get 25 to 30 minutes. But then the next guy, he might get 35 to 40 minutes. I've seen guys with military guys, in particular civil support team people that I did training with years ago, that are in top shape and excellent condition on a 45-minute bottle. They're getting an hour and 15 minutes. So it just depends on how you're physically able to use it. And they did things like skip breathing and things that they trained with to extend their time. But there's also disadvantages to that, because now I'm in that case they might have been in a level A suit. Well, they're in that suit for a lot longer than maybe they should be because of the physiological issues that they need to be aware of. So we just need to understand the improvements that are out there and how do we best manage them and to do our job. Kyle, you talked about an important piece when you talk about wildland gear versus structural gear. In Wisconsin, in places where there's risk for wildland fire, you definitely need to have that lighter weight gear that still is Nomex and provides protection. Putting people, especially, and again, kind of back to the discussion with volunteers versus career, but you put a lot of these volunteers that have guys that are not maybe in the best of condition or best of shape, and you throw them in turnout gear out on a wildland fire, and they're dropping like flies. We need to make sure that we've got people in the right level of protection, and certainly if you can get wildland gear, if you've got that as a risk factor, that's going to be a huge advantage to you. It's lighter weight, but yet provides a protection for wildland, obviously different than structural. Brandon Acker, you talked about increasing cancer rates as a problem, and that certainly is, and I think we've just hit the tip of the iceberg with that, because I mean the research is continuing to show that is becoming a greater and greater risk factor, and kind of what you said here, Andy, about research and adapting the young versus the old ways of doing things. I hear it here at the station, old school. We did this old school versus some of the new techniques, and we have to balance that, because not all the old ways of doing things were bad or wrong. In fact, Captain I mentioned that's got 43 years on the department, a lot of the things that he used to do is what they're talking about doing now, with hitting it hard from the yard with 2.5 through an open window. He did that 30 years, 40 years ago, and it's kind of coming back around, and we see that techniques, things like that, come back around. So, but some of the newer techniques, shutting the door, limiting the path flow, all important things, and we just need to balance, as you mentioned, balance those new ideas, new techniques to the old ones, because some of the old ones are still pertinent and valid. Jeremy, you talked about PPE advancements, and all great, but as you mentioned, we don't want to get tunnel vision. We have to still understand and recognize what the risk factors are and what our limitations are with that. So certainly good things to pay attention to. Eric, you talked about cleaning gear and carcinogens. I wrote a paper for the Wisconsin State Fire Chiefs Association a number of years back talking about washing our gear and not carrying your gear in your personal vehicle, for the volunteers in particular, because you put not only yourself but your families at risk. And that is very important, washing your gear after calls, because those carcinogens get embedded into those materials, and we get exposed time and time again if we're not cleaning them. Matthew, you talked about speaking up when it's unsafe, and again, we want to encourage people to do that, because we may have safety officers. You talked about safety officers in your post there. We may have a safety officer, but how many eyes and ears does that safety officer have? Hopefully he's got 2 eyes and 2 ears, and they both, they're all working. But if they can't see everything, I mean, they can only see what's in front of them. We need everybody to really be safety officers so that they can all share and point out, hey, something's going on here, and speak up about it. So very good comment there. And Drew, you talked about some people, they're afraid of criticism by speaking up, and we just have to kind of get past that if you're speaking up for the right reasons, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. But unfortunately, our business, we see it. You get criticized for saying something, and we have to just kind of work through that, and that's an unfortunate part of our business. It's not right, but it is what it is, and if it becomes a problem, then obviously we need to move that up the chain so that it gets handled appropriately. And then Brandon S., you kind of talked about PPE, SCBAs, air monitoring, toxics, all those comments, and again, new technologies that are there to help us to better be safe on the fire ground and what we do, and we just need to understand what the capabilities and their limitations are so that we use them appropriately. So again, week 3, lot of great discussion. Like I said, I've been very pleased with the discussion I've been hearing. So and reading, and keep that up. And I'll close off this video, and I'll make up another one here shortly on the week 4 comments. And again, I appreciate everybody's hard work in the class. So thanks, and again, I'll talk to you soon.